That's poverty and delusion, wrapped in leather binding. Blonde CEO Victoria Hayes announced with crystalline cruelty as she gestured toward the worn Bible that black janitor Samuel Hayes carried tucked under his arm while clearing champagne glasses during Pinnacle Global's annual charity gala. Her voice carrying across the Plaza Hotel's grand ballroom, where 300 of Manhattan's wealthiest elite had gathered to celebrate their own generosity, while a black custodial worker's most sacred possession became entertainment for people whose wealth could never purchase the kind of faith that transforms suffering into something bearable. The Bible was indeed worn, leather cover cracked and faded from 15 years of constant handling, pages soft and fragile from tears that had fallen during midnight hours when grief made sleep impossible. The gold leaf lettering that had once spelled Holy Bible, now barely visible beneath the patina of loss that made every touch both memorial and torture for someone whose relationship with God had ended the day his wife and daughter died, despite thousands of prayers that had apparently reached empty heaven. At 52, Samuel Hayes possessed the kind of profound brokenness that characterized former pastors whose faith had been destroyed not by intellectual doubt, but by unanswered prayers that had cost him everything. His 8-year-old daughter, Lily's death from leukemia, that better insurance could have treated successfully his wife Grace's suicide 3 months later, accompanied by a note blaming God for silence, and Samuel for preaching false promises about prayer's power to heal innocent children whose only sin was being poor. "Ma'am, I apologize if my personal item offends you," Samuel replied quietly, his voice carrying the careful deference that 52 years of navigating white corporate spaces had taught him was essential for survival, even as something ancient and wounded twisted behind his ribs where faith used to live, before it had been replaced by grief so profound that even atheism seemed like too much certainty about a universe that had proven itself capable of infinite cruelty. "Offends me?" Victoria laughed, the sound sharp and performative as she played to her audience of hedge fund managers and pharmaceutical heirs whose net worth exceeded small nations' GDP. "I'm fascinated by people who carry fairy tales like their insurance policies against reality. Tell me, does your God pay your rent when you pray hard enough, or does he just provide the delusion that poverty is somehow noble?" The cruelty was both casual and calculated, the kind that wealthy people deployed when they needed to reassert hierarchy through public humiliation, transforming human dignity into entertainment for crowds whose comfort depended on maintaining clear boundaries between those who served and those who were served, between those who believed in invisible protection and those whose wealth made protection tangible and purchasable. But the mockery that Victoria expected to generate laughter instead created uncomfortable silence, as even Manhattan's most jaded observers recognized that she had crossed from social commentary into something that felt like desecration of grief that wealth couldn't understand or purchase. "Ms. Hayes, this Bible doesn't represent my faith," Samuel said quietly, his voice carrying exhaustion that came from 15 years of carrying memorial that everyone assumed was devotion. "I stopped believing in God the day he let my 8-year-old daughter die in agony while I prayed, and my congregation prayed, and every promise I had ever preached about faith healing turned out to be beautiful lies that meant nothing when actual children needed actual medicine that actual money could have purchased." The confession hit the ballroom like detonation, not because wealthy people were unused to hearing about poverty and loss, but because a custodial worker had just articulated theological crisis with sophistication that contradicted their assumptions about service workers' intellectual and spiritual depth. "Then why carry it?" Victoria asked, her curiosity genuine despite her continued cruelty. "If you don't believe, why not throw away the fairy tale book?" "Because between these pages are the only things I have left of the family that poverty and unanswered prayers destroyed." Samuel replied, his hands trembling as he held the Bible that represented both his greatest loss and his only tangible connection to Grace and Lily. For 3 heartbeats, Samuel stood frozen by competing impulses. The survival instinct that warned him to maintain privacy about grief that wealthy people would never understand, and something deeper that recognized Victoria as cruel certainty deserved confrontation with the reality that her mockery couldn't comprehend. "Would you like to see what poverty and delusion actually look like, Ms. Hayes?" Samuel asked, his voice dropping to tone that made several nearby guests step back unconsciously, recognizing something devastating in the way he moved as he approached Victoria with the Bible that had become shrine to everything that prayers couldn't save. "By all means," Victoria replied, though something in Samuel's eyes should have warned her that opening this Bible would reveal truths she wasn't prepared to confront. What happened next would be replayed millions of times across social media platforms and analyzed by grief counselors, theologians, and social commentators trying to understand how 30 seconds of revelation could expose the toxic core of American inequality, while demonstrating that the things we mock from positions of privilege often carry stories that could teach us everything we never knew we needed to learn about the difference between wealth and worth. Samuel opened the Bible to pages he knew by location rather than reference. The Book of Psalms, where Grace had pressed flowers from Lily's funeral, where her suicide note had been folded for 15 years, where every page carried annotations in Grace's handwriting that documented their daughter's decline and her growing rage at God, who apparently valued prayers less than health insurance policies. The first thing that fell out was a pressed lily. The flower they had named their daughter after, preserved from the funeral that Samuel's congregation had paid for because he had spent every dollar he possessed on medical treatments that insurance wouldn't cover, and that charity couldn't sustain for 18 months of childhood leukemia that better coverage would have treated successfully. The second thing was a child's drawing, crude crayon sketch of stick figures labeled "Daddy and Me with Jesus," created during one of Lily's good days, when she still believed that God was listening to their prayers and that faith could overcome cancer that required medical interventions their poverty made inaccessible. The third thing was a photograph, wedding picture, showing Samuel in a suit that had been borrowed and Grace in a simple dress that had been beautiful because she was wearing it. Both of them radiant with the kind of hope that characterized people whose faith made poverty seem temporary and whose love made suffering seem bearable until actual medical crisis revealed that devotion couldn't replace the resources that wealth provided automatically. Victoria picked up the photograph with hands that had begun trembling, her face draining of color as she processed features that seemed impossible but unmistakable. Grace's face was her own face from 20 years ago. Grace's smile was the smile she remembered from childhood before their father's abuse had made families something to escape rather than preserve. "Where did you get this photograph?" Victoria whispered, her voice barely audible, as she stared at the image of her sister. The sister who had disappeared 15 years ago, the sister whose phone calls Victoria had ignored during her corporate ascent because family drama seemed like distraction from building career that would prove she was just another victim of their father's abuse. "That's my wife Grace on our wedding day," Samuel replied, watching Victoria's recognition transform from confusion to horror as she understood that the Bible she had mocked as poverty and delusion contained evidence that her missing sister had been found, had been married, had been mother, had been dead for 15 years, while Victoria had been too consumed with corporate success to answer phone calls that might have saved 2 lives. "Grace Hayes was your wife," Victoria asked, though the question was rhetorical because the photograph made denial impossible, and because the fourth item that had fallen from the Bible, a suicide note written in handwriting that Victoria recognized with absolute certainty as belonging to the sister she had abandoned, was now lying on the floor between them like accusation that no amount of wealth or success could ever answer. Victoria bent to pick up the suicide note with hands that shook so violently she could barely grasp the paper that had been folded and refolded so many times that the creases had weakened to transparency, revealing that Samuel had read this note countless times during 15 years of processing betrayal that transcended even the theological crisis of unanswered prayers. The note was brief. Grace had never been eloquent, had always been direct in ways that their father had punished as disrespect, but which Samuel had loved as honesty, that made every word feel genuine rather than performative. "Samuel, I can't do this anymore. Lily died because we couldn't afford the treatment that would have saved her. I prayed until I had no voice left. You prayed until your congregation stopped believing. God never answered. But you know who could have answered? My sister Victoria. I called her 47 times begging for help, paying for Lily's treatment. She never answered a single call. I left messages explaining that her niece was dying from treatable cancer. She never called back. I sent letters to her corporate office. They were returned unopened. Faith didn't save Lily. Money would have. Victoria had money. She chose her career over her family. Tell her that her ambition killed us both. Tell her I waited. She never came." The ballroom silence that followed Victoria's scream was absolute. The kind that occurred when 300 wealthy people confronted that their comfortable assumptions about poverty and faith had just been shattered by revelation that success could be built on corpses of family members whose desperate pleas for help had been dismissed as distraction from corporate advancement. Some discoveries about immediate tragedy reveal that the things we mock from positions of privilege carry stories that could destroy us if we understood what our choices had cost the people who loved us, and that sometimes the most sacred texts are not religious devotion, but memorial to everyone who died while we were too busy building success to answer phone calls from family members whose only crime was needing help that our wealth could have provided if we had valued human connection more than professional achievement. Before we continue with this devastating story, I need to ask you something. If this story is touching your heart, if you're feeling the weight of what Victoria just discovered, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel. We bring you stories that reveal profound truths about humanity, faith, family, and the choices that define who we really are. Hit that like button if you're feeling the emotional impact of this narrative. And please comment below and tell me, what time is it where you're watching this? What country or city are you joining us from? Have you ever faced a choice between career and family? Has someone you loved ever asked for help that you ignored? Share this video with someone who needs to understand that success built on the bodies of people we love is never worth the cost. And make sure you turn on notification bell so you don't miss when we post the continuation of this heartbreaking story. The investigation that would force Victoria Hayes to confront every decision she had made during her 15-year corporate ascent began at 3:42 a.m. in her penthouse office, 6 hours after she had collapsed in the Plaza Hotel ballroom holding her dead sister's suicide note, while 300 witnesses processed that Manhattan's most successful pharmaceutical CEO had built her empire while her own sister and niece died begging for help she had been too busy to provide. "Ms. Hayes, I need to understand the timeline of when Grace attempted to contact you," said private investigator Rachel Morrison, whose midnight emergency hire reflected Victoria's desperate need to know exactly how many opportunities she had missed to save her sister and niece before their deaths had become inevitable rather than preventable. Victoria felt her chest constrict as she stared at her phone records from 15 years ago. The corporate assistant had retrieved archived data showing 47 incoming calls from Grace's number over 18-month period, each call lasting between 8 and 47 seconds before reaching voicemail that Victoria's instructions had automatically deleted without her ever hearing messages that might have saved 2 lives. "The first call came on March 14th, 15 years ago," Rachel reported, her voice carrying professional detachment that couldn't completely mask human horror about data she was presenting. "Grace called your direct office line at 2:17 p.m. on a Tuesday. She called again at 2:34 p.m., then 2:51 p.m., then 3:08 p.m. 4 calls in 1 hour, suggesting genuine emergency rather than casual reconnection attempt." "I don't remember any of those calls," Victoria whispered, though the calendar data showed that March 14th, 15 years ago, had been the day of her first major board presentation, the meeting that had secured her promotion to VP of Strategic Development and had required her complete focus on performance that would prove she deserved advancement rather than being distracted by family matters she had deliberately left behind. "Ms. Hayes, your phone records show that during the 18 months when Grace was calling, you averaged 87-hour work weeks and took 0 personal calls during business hours," Rachel continued, providing context that made Victoria's unavailability seem simultaneously justified by professional demands and morally indefensible when measured against her sister's increasingly desperate need for help that only Victoria's wealth could provide. The timeline was both technically accurate and spiritually devastating. Victoria had been building career success through exactly the kind of single-minded focus that corporate America rewarded and celebrated, while Grace had been watching their 8-year-old daughter die from cancer that better insurance could have treated successfully if her successful sister had answered even 1 of 47 phone calls. Meanwhile, Samuel Hayes was experiencing his own crisis as media coverage of the gala confrontation had attracted attention from his former congregation, the church members who had supported him through Lily's illness until their faith had been shattered by her death, and his subsequent abandonment of ministry that had seemed like betrayal of community that had tried to help even when their collective resources had been inadequate for medical costs that exceeded their entire annual budget. "Pastor Hayes, we heard about what happened with Mrs. Victoria Hayes," said Deacon Marcus Williams during the phone call that interrupted Samuel's attempt to process whether Victoria's horror about discovering Grace's death represented genuine grief or just embarrassment about public exposure of family dysfunction. "The church has been praying that you would find peace about Sister Grace and little Lily." "Marcus, I'm not Pastor Hayes anymore," Samuel replied, his voice carrying exhaustion about religious titles that felt like mockery after 15 years of living with unanswered prayers that had killed his family. "I lost my faith the day God let Lily die, and I lost my calling, the day I realized that every sermon I had ever preached about faith healing was beautiful lie that meant nothing when children needed medicine rather than prayers. But Brother Samuel, the church never stopped believing that God had purpose in allowing Sister Grace and Lily to transition," Marcus continued, using theological language that transformed tragedy into divine plan, despite obvious reality that Lily's death had resulted from poverty rather than heavenly intention. "Marcus, Lily didn't transition. She died in agony from cancer that better insurance would have treated successfully," Samuel replied with brutal honesty. "And Grace didn't find God's purpose. She killed herself because prayers didn't save our daughter, while her wealthy sister was too busy with board meetings to answer phone calls that might have provided the actual help that actual money could have purchased." The exchange revealed the theological crisis that had consumed Samuel for 15 years. Not abstract questions about suffering and divine justice, but concrete rage about religious community whose faith had been worthless compared to resources that Victoria's wealth could have provided if she had valued family over career advancement. As Victoria processed phone records while Samuel confronted former congregation whose faith he couldn't share, both participants were discovering that the person who connected their tragedies was also the person who had enabled them. Victoria's father, Robert Hayes, who had been board member at Pinnacle Global throughout Victoria's career advancement, and who had known about Grace's calls without ever mentioning to his daughter that her sister was desperately seeking help. "Victoria, we need to discuss what your father knew about Grace's situation," Rachel reported during their follow-up meeting, presenting evidence that transformed family tragedy into systematic deception. Robert Hayes received notification from Grace's hospital when Lily was admitted for leukemia treatment because he was listed as emergency contact on Grace's outdated medical forms from before she ran away. "My father knew that Grace was alive and that Lily existed," Victoria asked, her voice carrying both shock and growing recognition that her corporate success had been enabled by Robert's deliberate concealment of family crisis that might have distracted her from advancement he was orchestrating. "Your father knew everything," Rachel confirmed, displaying hospital records that showed Robert had been contacted multiple times about Grace's inability to pay for Lily's treatment, about Grace's requests to reach Victoria, about the mounting medical debt that was consuming what little resources Grace and Samuel possessed, while their daughter's cancer progressed beyond successful treatment because early intervention had been delayed by insurance limitations and poverty. Robert told hospital administrators that Grace had made her choices by running away and that he wouldn't enable her poor decisions by providing financial assistance. Rachel continued, her professional detachment cracking slightly as she presented evidence of calculated cruelty. "He also instructed them not to contact you because you were focused on important career development that shouldn't be interrupted by family drama." The revelation meant that Victoria's ignorance about Grace's desperate situation hadn't been accidental unavailability, but systematic concealment orchestrated by their father, whose abuse had driven Grace away and whose manipulation had ensured that Victoria remained unaware of crisis that might have interfered with corporate advancement Robert was cultivating. "Ms. Hayes, I also need to show you the letters," Rachel said quietly, presenting a stack of 23 envelopes that had been returned unopened to Grace's address, letters that Grace had sent to Victoria's corporate office during the final 6 months of Lily's life, letters whose return had apparently contributed to Grace's growing despair about her sister's deliberate abandonment. Victoria opened the first letter with hands that trembled so violently she could barely unfold paper, that Grace had handled during what must have been increasingly hopeless attempts to reach sister who had once promised they would always protect each other from their father's abuse. "Victoria, I know you're busy with your important career, but I need you to know that I have a daughter named Lily who is 8 years old and dying from leukemia. The doctors say she could be saved with better treatment than our insurance covers. I don't know how to ask this, but you're my sister and Lily is your niece, and we are out of options. Please call me. Please help us. I wouldn't ask if we weren't desperate. Love, Grace." The letter was dated 7 months before Grace's suicide, 7 months when intervention could have saved Lily's life. 7 months when Victoria had been so consumed with preparing for CEO promotion that personal mail had been automatically returned by assistants whose instructions were to eliminate any distractions from Victoria's professional focus. Some moral choices require confronting that the success we celebrate was built on deliberate ignorance of family members whose desperate pleas for help were systematically concealed by people whose manipulation ensured our focus remained on advancement rather than the human costs our priorities created for people who loved us enough to keep calling, even when we never answered. 4 weeks after the gala confrontation had made Victoria's family tragedy into viral sensation, with 17 million views and countless think pieces about corporate success built on family neglect, Victoria Hayes found herself standing outside Samuel's modest apartment in Queens at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, carrying two things that represented her attempt at impossible atonement: a cashier's check for $8. $4 million, the amount her forensic accountants had calculated she would have earned during the hours she had spent on calls and meetings instead of answering Grace's 47 phone calls, and a worn leather journal containing every letter, every voicemail transcript, every hospital bill that documented exactly how her sister and niece had died while she had been too successful to notice. "Mr. Hayes, I know that money can't bring back Grace or Lily," Victoria said when Samuel opened the door, his eyes red from lack of sleep that characterized people whose grief had been made public spectacle for millions of strangers to consume and comment on. "But I need you to understand that I've spent the past month reconstructing every moment when I chose career over family. And I want to fund something that could prevent other families from experiencing what poverty and my neglect cost yours." Samuel stared at the check with expression that combined rage and exhaustion. The amount was obscene, representing more money than he would earn in multiple lifetimes of custodial work, but also representing exact calculation of how much Victoria's time had been worth during the period when Grace and Lily had been dying and begging for help that never came. "Ms. Hayes, you think $8. $4 million makes up for 47 unanswered calls?" Samuel asked, his voice carrying controlled fury that 15 years of grief had refined into something more devastating than shouting. "You've calculated the precise value of your working hours during the period when my wife and daughter were dying. But can you calculate the value of Lily's last words, asking why Aunt Victoria didn't love her enough to help? Can you calculate the value of Grace's suicide note, specifically blaming you for choosing career over family?" The questions were both unanswerable and necessary. Victoria's attempt at financial atonement revealed that even her guilt had been processed through corporate logic that measured everything in dollars rather than in love, in Excel spreadsheets rather than in broken promises to sister who had once believed that blood mattered more than business advancement. "Mr. Hayes, I can't calculate those values because they're infinite, and I destroyed them through negligence that no amount of money can repair," Victoria replied, her voice breaking in ways that corporate training had never prepared her for. "But I also can't bring them back. And spending the rest of my life in guilt doesn't honor their memory as much as creating systems that prevent other Graces and Lilies from dying because their family members are too consumed with success to answer desperate calls for help." The proposal was both ethically sound and emotionally insufficient. Samuel needed Victoria to suffer in ways that matched his 15 years of grief, but her suffering wouldn't resurrect Grace or Lily, or restore the faith that their deaths had destroyed, leaving only question of whether preventing future tragedies represented meaningful atonement or just another form of corporate performance that allowed Victoria to feel better about failures that remained unforgivable. Meanwhile, Robert Hayes was experiencing his own reckoning as media investigation had exposed that his concealment of Grace's crisis hadn't been isolated decision, but systematic pattern of manipulation designed to ensure Victoria's corporate focus remained undistracted by family complications that might have interfered with advancement he was orchestrating for his own legacy purposes. "Robert, the board is demanding your resignation, citing moral turpitude and reputational damage to Pinnacle Global," reported board chairman Thomas Bradley during emergency executive session. "Your deliberate concealment of your granddaughter's terminal illness from your other daughter while she was rising through our executive ranks creates liability exposure that threatens our corporate governance standards. Thomas, my decision to protect Victoria's focus during critical career development was sound parenting that prioritized long-term success over short-term emotional distraction." Robert replied, using language that revealed how completely he had internalized corporate values that measured parental love through professional advancement rather than through family support during medical crisis. But Robert, Victoria's success was built on systematic deception that resulted in preventable deaths of your daughter and granddaughter, Thomas continued, his voice carrying controlled alarm about board member whose values had become liability rather than asset. That's not sound parenting, that's sociopathic prioritization of business outcomes over human welfare. The confrontation revealed how corporate culture could transform parental manipulation into career strategy, treating family tragedy as acceptable cost of maintaining executive focus that benefited shareholders while destroying the human relationships that made professional success meaningful rather than just profitable. As Victoria attempted atonement while Robert faced consequences, Samuel was discovering that his viral exposure had attracted attention from his former congregation, whose responses revealed deep divisions about whether his loss of faith represented understandable grief or betrayal of community that had tried to help despite inadequate resources. "Brother Samuel, the church wants you to know that we understand your anger at Sister Victoria, but we're concerned that you're using her wealth as excuse to avoid confronting why you abandoned God instead of trusting his timing," said Pastor David Martinez, who had replaced Samuel as spiritual leader after Grace's suicide had made Samuel's continued ministry impossible. "Pastor Martinez, I didn't abandon God. I realized he was never there," Samuel replied, with brutal honesty about theological transformation that 15 years hadn't softened. "Every prayer I offered for Lily was met with silence, while an insurance company algorithm decided she wasn't worth treating. Every sermon I preached about faith healing became lie when actual medicine required actual money that faith communities couldn't provide despite genuine devotion. But Samuel, testing faith through suffering has biblical precedent, and Lily's death could have deeper purpose that we can't understand in our limited human perspective," Martinez continued, using theological framework that transformed child's death into divine lesson rather than acknowledging systematic failure of religious community whose prayers had been worthless compared to resources that Victoria's wealth could have provided. "Martinez, if God's purpose for Lily was to teach me that prayers don't work and that poverty kills children despite faith, then mission accomplished," Samuel said, his sarcasm masking profound pain about religious community, whose response to tragedy had been to defend God rather than to acknowledge that their theological promises had failed when tested by actual crisis requiring actual resources. Over the following weeks, as Victoria worked with medical policy experts to create Lily's Law, legislation requiring emergency medical treatment for children regardless of insurance status, while Samuel navigated media attention that made his grief into public discourse about faith and poverty, both participants understood that atonement required sustained commitment to systematic change rather than just personal guilt or financial gestures. "Mr. Hayes, Victoria's proposed legislation could save thousands of children by ensuring that treatable conditions like Lily's leukemia don't become fatal due to insurance limitations or poverty," reported healthcare advocate Dr. Sarah Chen during their consultation about whether Samuel would support policy initiative bearing his daughter's name. "Dr. Chen, legislation named after my daughter doesn't bring her back, and it doesn't address the fundamental reality that Victoria had resources to save Lily but chose career advancement over answering phone calls from desperate sister," Samuel replied, his resistance revealing that systemic reform felt like inadequate response to personal betrayal that no policy could undo. "But Mr. Hayes, preventing future Lilies from dying due to treatable conditions represents exactly the kind of purpose that could transform your grief into something that honors your daughter's memory rather than just preserving your anger at Victoria," Dr. Chen continued, providing framework for understanding that atonement required choosing between nursing justified rage and preventing others from experiencing similar tragedy. As their collaboration developed despite Samuel's resistance and Victoria's guilt, both understood that Grace's suicide note had created moral obligation that transcended their personal emotions. The note had specifically blamed Victoria's career prioritization, but it had also revealed systematic failures of healthcare, religious community, and family structure that had combined to make Lily's death inevitable once Grace's desperate calls had gone unanswered. "Samuel, I want to show you something that Grace wrote that wasn't in the suicide note," Victoria said during one of their increasingly frequent strategy meetings, presenting journal that Grace had kept during Lily's illness. Journal whose pages revealed not just rage at Victoria, but also profound love for Samuel and documentation of his attempts to help despite inadequate resources. The journal entries transform narrative from simple story about Victoria's neglect into complex account of how poverty, inadequate insurance, religious communities' limitations, and family dysfunction had combined to create circumstances where child's death became preventable tragedy that multiple systems had failed to prevent despite Grace and Samuel's desperate attempts to navigate obstacles that their combined efforts couldn't overcome. Some sacrifices require understanding that atonement means creating systematic change that prevents future tragedies rather than just accepting punishment for past failures, and that honoring dead children sometimes requires collaboration between people whose relationship was destroyed by those deaths, but whose shared commitment to preventing similar losses could transform grief into purpose that benefits communities beyond their personal pain. 8 weeks after Victoria had established the Grace and Lily Memorial Foundation with $50 million initial endowment, not as atonement, but a systematic commitment to preventing treatable childhood illnesses from becoming fatal due to poverty or insurance limitations, Samuel Hayes arrived at the Foundation's headquarters carrying something he had never shown anyone except therapists who had tried unsuccessfully to help him process 15 years of compounded grief. Grace's complete journal from Lily's illness. 340 pages, documenting everything from diagnosis through death, through Grace's final descent into suicidal despair. "Victoria, you need to read this before we launch Lily's law, because Grace's journal reveals that blaming you for everything was her grief talking, not complete truth about what killed our daughter," Samuel said, his voice carrying exhaustion about recognizing that Victoria's guilt, while justified, was also incomplete understanding of systematic failures that had made Lily's death result of multiple cascading problems rather than just one sister's career obsession. Victoria accepted the journal with trembling hands, recognizing that Samuel's willingness to share Grace's private documentation represented trust that their collaboration had somehow earned, despite the fact that she remained person whose neglect had contributed to deaths that journal would document in Grace's own words. Over the following hours, Victoria read entries that transformed her understanding of her sister's final years from simple narrative about unanswered calls into complex documentation of how healthcare system, religious community, financial constraints and family dysfunction had combined to create circumstances where every potential solution had been blocked by obstacles that Grace and Samuel had tried desperately to overcome. March 15th, 15 years ago, Lily was diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia today. Dr. Martinez says it's highly treatable with immediate chemotherapy. Our insurance covers 60% of treatment costs. The other 40% will be approximately $180,000 over 18 months. Samuel's church has maybe $12,000 in emergency funds. I called Victoria today, 4 times. She didn't answer. I know she's busy with her career, but she's my sister, and Lily is her niece. Surely she would want to know. I'll try again tomorrow. April 3. Lily started chemotherapy. The side effects are horrible. Vomiting, hair loss, constant fatigue. Samuel stays up with her every night praying while I research financial assistance programs. We've applied to 23 different charity organizations. 17 have rejected us because we make too much. Samuel's pastor salary is $34,000 a year. 6 are reviewing our application. I called Victoria again today, twice. Her assistant said she's in important meetings and can't take personal calls. I left message explaining that Lily has cancer. No response. June 12th. The church held fundraiser that raised $8,400. People gave everything they could. Mrs. Johnson, who's on disability, gave $50. Mr. Williams, who just lost his job, gave $100. Our community is trying so hard, but we need $180,000, and we've raised $20,400 total. Lily's cancer is progressing faster than initial projections. Dr. Martinez says we need to intensify treatment, which means more money. I called Victoria 8 times this week. Her office keeps saying she'll call back. She never does. Samuel says we need to trust God's timing. I'm starting to doubt God is listening. September 28th. Lily's cancer has spread because we had to delay treatment when we couldn't pay. Dr. Martinez says if we had started aggressive therapy in March, her survival rate would have been 94%. Now it's 67% and dropping. We're $89,000 in debt. The hospital is threatening to discharge Lily to palliative care, which means letting her die comfortably instead of treating aggressively. I wrote Victoria a letter explaining everything. I mailed it to her corporate office certified mail. It was returned unopened with notes saying, Ms. Hayes doesn't accept personal correspondence at business address. Samuel's faith is breaking. Mine is already broken. God isn't answering our prayers. Victoria isn't answering our calls. Our daughter is dying and nobody with power to help is listening. The entries continued through 18 months of progressively desperate attempts to save Lily, while every potential resource proved inadequate. The church's fundraising couldn't match medical costs. Charitable organizations had bureaucratic limitations that moved slower than cancer. Insurance companies had algorithms that valued cost containment over child survival. And Victoria's corporate success had made her systematically unreachable to family members whose crisis couldn't be scheduled. Into business calendar. Samuel, I had no idea that Grace tried so many other options before calling me, Victoria said, her voice breaking as she processed that her sister's 47 calls had represented last resort after multiple systems had failed rather than first request that Victoria had ignored. I thought I was the only person who could have saved them. But Grace's journal shows that insurance companies, hospitals, churches, and charity organizations all had opportunities to help that they didn't take or couldn't provide. Victoria, you weren't the only person who failed Grace and Lily, but you were the only person who had immediate resources to solve their problem and chose not to answer calls because career seemed more important than family. Samuel replied with brutal honesty. Grace tried everything else first. She called you last and most desperately because you were her sister, and she believed blood would matter more than your ambition. She was wrong. The assessment was both accurate and devastating, revealing that while systematic failures had contributed to Lily's death, Victoria's specific choice to ignore Grace's calls represented personal betrayal that transcended institutional limitations. Insurance companies were following algorithms, hospitals were following policies, churches were limited by resources, but Victoria had been limited only by priorities that valued professional advancement over sisters' desperate pleas. As their alliance deepened through shared reading of Grace's journal while preparing to launch Lily's Law, both participants understood that preventing future tragedies required addressing both systematic failures and personal choices that had combined to make treatable childhood illness fatal despite multiple potential intervention points. Mr. Hayes, the Foundation has identified 847 children currently in situations similar to Lily's, treatable conditions that insurance limitations or poverty are making fatal, reported Foundation Director Dr. Patricia Martinez during their strategic planning meeting. Lily's law would cover approximately 600 of those cases immediately, but the other 247 would still fall through gaps because proposed legislation has limitations for undocumented families or situations involving experimental treatments. Dr. Martinez, that means our law would save 600 children but fail 247 others whose families would experience exactly what Grace and I experienced. Watching treatable conditions become fatal because systematic limitations make actual help inaccessible despite genuine need, Samuel observed, his expertise about healthcare gaps coming from lived experience rather than policy analysis. Which is why we need to expand Lily's law beyond what's politically viable to pass quickly, Victoria added, her corporate strategy skills recognizing that comprehensive solution might delay helping the 600 who could be saved immediately while pursuing perfect policy that might never achieve political support necessary for implementation. The strategic tension revealed how advocacy required balancing immediate help for some against comprehensive justice for all, choosing between saving 600 children now while failing 247 or pursuing perfect solution that might save no one if political opposition prevented any legislation from passing. Over the following weeks, as media coverage of the Grace and Lily Memorial Foundation attracted both support and criticism, critics arguing that Victoria's charitable work represented guilt PR rather than genuine atonement, while supporters celebrated systematic reform emerging from personal tragedy, both Victoria and Samuel confronted reality that public advocacy meant their private grief would be continuously dissected by strangers whose commentary treated their loss as content rather than as actual human tragedy. Samuel, the Foundation is receiving death threats from people who believe that Lily's death was God's will and that our legislation represents interference with divine plan, Victoria reported during their security briefing. They're specifically targeting you as failed pastor who lost faith, and me as corporate villain who killed her own family. Victoria, we knew that advocating for systematic change would attract opposition from people whose theology requires believing that child poverty and preventable deaths serve divine purposes, Samuel replied, his exhausted recognition revealing how religious resistance to healthcare reform often came from believers whose faith required interpreting suffering as meaningful rather than acknowledging that better policies could prevent tragedies that prayers couldn't address. Some alliances require understanding that systematic reform emerging from personal tragedy will always attract opposition from people who prefer believing that suffering serves higher purposes rather than acknowledging that better policies and personal choices could prevent deaths that we prefer to interpret as inevitable rather than as results of systematic and individual failures that collaboration could address through sustained commitment to change. The crisis that would determine whether Grace and Lily's deaths could generate meaningful reform or remain just another viral tragedy reached its breaking point when Robert Hayes, Victoria's father, and the man whose manipulation had ensured his granddaughter's death through systematic concealment, launched comprehensive legal and media campaign to destroy both the Foundation and Lily's law, arguing that Victoria's guilt-driven crusade represented dangerous government overreach that would bankrupt healthcare systems while dishonoring his daughter Grace's personal choices that had led to unfortunate but ultimately unavoidable tragedy. Victoria, your father has filed injunctions seeking to block Lily's law on grounds that it violates fiscal responsibility and creates moral hazard by rewarding families who don't adequately plan for medical emergencies, reported Foundation legal counsel Jennifer Torres during their emergency strategy meeting. He's arguing that Grace's poverty resulted from poor life choices and that legislation in her name encourages irresponsible behavior by eliminating natural consequences of those choices. The legal argument was both financially sophisticated and morally reprehensible, transforming 8-year-old child's death from preventable tragedy into cautionary tale about personal responsibility, suggesting that Lily had died not because healthcare system had failed, but because Grace and Samuel had made choices that Robert characterized as leaving stable family for poverty and religious delusion. My father is arguing that his granddaughter deserved to die because her mother married a pastor instead of pursuing corporate career, Victoria asked, her voice carrying rage that 15 years of corporate training couldn't contain. He's claiming that Grace's choice to escape his abuse and find love and faith represented irresponsibility that justified letting Lily die from treatable cancer. Your father's legal strategy is positioning Grace's entire adult life, her marriage, her faith, her poverty, as series of choices that eliminated any obligation for family or society to provide assistance when consequences of those choices became medically catastrophic, Jennifer explained, providing legal framework that revealed how systematic contempt for poverty could be weaponized into arguments against healthcare reform. Meanwhile, Samuel was experiencing his own confrontation as his former congregation had divided over whether supporting Lily's law represented faithful advocacy for vulnerable populations or dangerous secular humanism that replaced God's sovereignty with government intervention that undermined religious communities' responsibility to care for their own members through voluntary charity rather than mandatory legislation. Brother Samuel, the Church Council has voted to formally oppose Lily's law because it represents government overreach that could reduce charitable giving by making people believe that healthcare is government responsibility rather than opportunity for Christians to demonstrate faith through voluntary support of suffering families, Pastor David Martinez announced during their contentious meeting. Pastor Martinez, the church had $12,000 available when Lily needed $180,000 in treatment, Samuel replied, his voice carrying controlled fury about religious community whose opposition to healthcare reform was built on nostalgic fantasy about charitable capacity that his actual experience had proven inadequate. Your voluntary charity was worthless when my daughter needed actual medicine that actual money could have purchased. Faith didn't save Lily, money would have. Victoria had money. The church had prayers. Prayers don't cure leukemia. But Samuel, replacing voluntary Christian charity with government mandates, eliminates opportunity for believers to demonstrate faith through sacrificial giving. Martinez continued, using theological logic that treated healthcare access as spiritual test rather than basic human right that children shouldn't die lacking. Martinez, my daughter died during your opportunity for sacrificial giving, Samuel said, his brutal honesty cutting through religious rhetoric that transformed child's death into theological lesson. Every prayer you offered while Lily suffered was worthless compared to legislation that would have guaranteed treatment, regardless of whether Christians felt inspired to demonstrate faith through voluntary donations that never materialized in amounts adequate to save her life. The confrontation revealed deep theological divide between religious communities who believed that systematic reform undermined faith-based charity, and advocates who recognized that voluntary giving had proven systematically inadequate for healthcare crises, requiring immediate resources that charitable impulses couldn't consistently provide. As both Robert's legal campaign and religious opposition to Lily's law gained momentum, while media coverage transformed Grace and Lily's story into political battleground about healthcare reform and personal responsibility, the Foundation discovered evidence that would either destroy Robert's credibility or confirm his arguments about Grace's choices. Comprehensive documentation showing that Robert hadn't just concealed Grace's crisis from Victoria, but had actively blocked Grace's attempts to access help from multiple sources by using his corporate influence to interfere with charitable organizations and hospital financial assistance programs. Victoria, we've obtained emails showing that your father contacted 3 charitable organizations that had approved assistance for Lily's treatment and convinced them to rescind approval by arguing that Grace was manipulating the system and that helping her would enable irresponsible behavior, Jennifer reported, presenting evidence that transformed Robert's passive concealment into active sabotage of Grace's attempts to save her daughter. My father deliberately blocked charitable assistance that would have saved Lily's life, Victoria asked, processing information that revealed Robert's manipulation had extended beyond concealing crisis from Victoria to systematically eliminating other potential resources that Grace had desperately sought. Robert told charitable organizations that Grace had wealthy family resources available, and that providing assistance would enable her to avoid reconciliation with family that could resolve financial problems. Jennifer continued, revealing how Robert had weaponized Victoria's wealth against Grace by suggesting that charitable assistance was unnecessary when family resources existed, resources that Robert was simultaneously ensuring Grace couldn't access by preventing Victoria from learning about crisis. The evidence meant that Lily's death hadn't resulted just from Victoria's unavailability or systematic healthcare failures, but from Robert's deliberate interference designed to force Grace into a situation where she would need to return to family she'd escaped, creating leverage that Robert could use to restore control over daughter whose independence he had never accepted. As Foundation prepared to release evidence of Robert's sabotage, while Lily's law faced political opposition from conservatives who agreed with Robert's arguments about personal responsibility and religious groups who feared government overreach, all participants understood that final confrontation would occur during congressional hearing where both Robert and Samuel had been called to testify about whether Grace and Lily's deaths justified healthcare reform or confirmed necessity of maintaining systems that treated medical assistance as earned privilege rather than guaranteed right. Mr. Hayes, please explain to this committee why you believe that legislation named after your deceased daughter represents appropriate response to tragedy that ultimately resulted from choices that you and your wife made about career, religion, and family planning, said Conservative Senator James Morrison during hearing that would determine Lily's law's political viability. Senator Morrison, my daughter died because treatable cancer became fatal when insurance limitations and poverty made adequate treatment inaccessible despite desperate attempts to find help from every available resource. Samuel replied, his testimony combining personal experience with systematic analysis. The choices that my wife Grace and I made were to love each other, to raise our daughter in faith community, and to seek help when medical crisis exceeded our resources. The choice that killed Lily was Victoria's choice to ignore 47 phone calls because career seemed more important than family, and Robert Hayes's choice to actively block charitable assistance because he valued control over his estranged daughter more than his granddaughter's life. But Mr. Hayes, didn't your choice to work as pastor with modest income rather than pursuing more lucrative career contribute to your inability to afford medical treatment? Morrison pressed, using questioning strategy that blamed poverty on personal choices rather than systematic wage structures that made certain professions financially unsustainable despite their social value. Senator, I chose to serve my community through ministry that provided spiritual support but modest compensation, Samuel replied. That choice didn't cause leukemia. It didn't create a healthcare system where insurance companies value profit over child survival. It didn't make Grace's sister ignore desperate calls for help. Lily died because multiple systems and individuals failed, and this legislation addresses some of those systematic failures, even though it can't address personal betrayals that also contributed to her death. The testimony was both personally devastating and politically effective, forcing congressional committee to confront that opposing Lily's law required either accepting that children should die from treatable illnesses when their families lack resources, or arguing that poverty itself represented moral failure, justifying medical abandonment. Some confrontations with institutional and personal evil require understanding that preventing future tragedies means choosing between perfect justice that punishes all responsible parties and imperfect reform that saves future lives even when it cannot resurrect past victims or adequately punish everyone whose choices contributed to preventable deaths. 22 months after congressional passage of Lily's law had guaranteed emergency medical treatment for all children, regardless of insurance status or family income. Legislation that had saved an estimated 2,847 children in its first year of implementation, while generating fierce ongoing political opposition from conservatives who viewed healthcare access as earned privilege rather than guaranteed right. Samuel Hayes stood at the grave where Grace and Lily were buried together, no longer alone, but accompanied by Victoria and 127 families whose children's lives had been saved by reform that Grace and Lily's deaths had ultimately created. The cemetery visit had become annual ritual, not religious observance, since Samuel's faith remained shattered beyond repair that any amount of legislative success could restore, but memorial acknowledgement that Grace and Lily's suffering had generated meaning beyond their individual tragedy, even though that meaning could never justify or compensate for losses that remained irredeemable, regardless of how many future children survived, because of reform their deaths had inspired. Grace, Lily, I don't know if you can hear this or if anything exists beyond the silence that answered our prayers when you were dying, Samuel said to the gravestone that bore both their names, with dates that documented how preventable their deaths had been and how completely systematic and personal failures had combined to make survival impossible. But 2,047 children are alive today because your deaths finally made people understand that healthcare access shouldn't depend on insurance coverage or family wealth or charitable impulses that never materialized in amounts adequate to save lives. At 54, Samuel possessed integrated identity that characterized people who had transformed devastating loss into sustained advocacy without requiring religious faith to justify their continued commitment to preventing others from experiencing similar tragedies. His grief remained profound, his anger at God remained absolute, but his dedication to Lily's law implementation had given him purpose that therapy and faith had both failed to provide during 15 years of processing compounded loss. Samuel, I need you to know that no amount of legislation or saved lives makes up for the 47 calls I didn't answer, Victoria said, her voice carrying acknowledgement that 22 months of foundation work and policy advocacy hadn't eliminated guilt that would define her remaining years, regardless of how much good emerged from her attempts at systematic atonement. Grace and Lily should be here. Every child we save through Lily's law represents both victory and reminder that you lost your family because I chose career over answering my sister's desperate pleas for help. At 40, Victoria possessed hard-earned wisdom about limitations of professional success, having learned through Grace's death that corporate achievement meant nothing compared to family bonds she had destroyed through priorities that American culture celebrated until personal cost became undeniable. Her pharmaceutical empire continued generating billions in revenue, but she measured success now through children saved rather than through shareholder returns that had once seemed like purpose. sufficient to justify systematic unavailability to family members who had needed her. As their memorial gathering continued, with testimonies from families whose children had survived because Lily's law had guaranteed treatment that insurance limitations or poverty would have made fatal under previous healthcare structures, all participants understood that Grace and Lily's deaths had created change that benefited thousands while remaining individually irredeemable tragedies that no amount of systematic reform could justify or compensate. Mr. Hayes, my daughter Sophia is alive because Lily's law guaranteed treatment for her neuroblastoma that our insurance had denied as experimental, said Maria Santos, holding 8-year-old Sophia, whose survival represented exactly the kind of preventable death that had killed Lily when insurance algorithms and poverty had eliminated access to treatments that wealth or better legislation could have provided. We light a candle for Lily every year on Sophia's birthday because we know that your daughter's death saved mine. The testimony was both gratifying and gutting. Sophia's survival proved that reform could prevent future tragedies. But her existence also highlighted that Lily's death had been unnecessary, that better systems implemented earlier could have saved both children rather than requiring one family's loss to generate political will necessary for protecting others. Over the following months, Robert Hayes, who had been convicted of fraud for his interference with charitable assistance and sentenced to 3 years in federal prison while being permanently removed from all corporate board positions, submitted formal apology to Victoria that arrived through his attorney rather than through direct communication that his pride apparently couldn't support even from prison. Victoria, I am writing to acknowledge that my actions in concealing Grace's medical crisis and blocking her access to charitable assistance contributed to circumstances that led to Lily's preventable death and Grace's subsequent suicide. My prioritization of your career advancement over family welfare represented moral failure that I now recognize as unforgivable. I do not expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that I understand the magnitude of harm my manipulation caused. Robert. Deal. The letter represented partial accountability that couldn't undo damage or restore relationships that Robert's abuse and manipulation had destroyed across 2 generations, leaving Victoria to process whether accepting father's belated recognition of wrongdoing represented necessary closure or just another form of manipulation designed to secure sympathy from daughter whose financial support he might eventually need. Samuel. My father's apology doesn't change anything about Grace and Lily's deaths, Victoria observed during their regular Foundation strategy meetings that had evolved into genuine friendship built on shared grief and sustained collaboration. But it does confirm that their deaths resulted from systematic failures and deliberate choices by multiple people rather than just inevitable tragedy that no intervention could have prevented. Victoria, understanding all the ways that various systems and individuals failed Grace and Lily doesn't eliminate your specific responsibility for ignoring 47 calls, Samuel replied with honesty that their friendship had earned. But it does mean that preventing future tragedies requires addressing both systematic healthcare failures and personal priorities that make career advancement seem more important than family members' desperate pleas for help. 3 years after the gala confrontation that had made Grace's suicide note public, Samuel published memoir that became unexpected bestseller, not because audiences enjoyed reading about child death and family tragedy, but because his brutal honesty about lost faith resonated with readers who had experienced prayers that seemed unanswered and religious communities whose support had proven inadequate during actual crisis requiring actual resources. I don't believe in God anymore, and I never will again, Samuel wrote in the memoir's conclusion that religious publishers had rejected but secular press had embraced. But I believe in Lily's law. I believe in the 2,847 children who survived their first year because legislation guaranteed treatment. I believe in the foundation that Victoria built from guilt and my collaboration born from shared grief. I believe that Grace and Lily's deaths could generate meaning without requiring me to believe those deaths served divine purpose. Sometimes the only resurrection possible is the one we create through ensuring that preventable tragedies stop being prevented by systematic and personal failures that we have power to address. The memoir generated both celebration and condemnation. Atheist readers celebrated validation of doubt, while religious communities condemned what they characterized as faith abandoned rather than faith tested and found wanting, revealing ongoing cultural division about whether legitimate response to unanswered prayer included rejecting God or required maintaining devotion, despite suffering that seemed incompatible with divine love. 5 years after Grace's death had been revealed through worn Bible that Victoria had mocked, Samuel stood in community health center that bore Lily's name, watching Victoria cut ribbon on facility that would provide free pediatric care to families whose insurance limitations or poverty had previously made preventive medicine inaccessible until treatable conditions became medical emergencies. "This isn't resurrection," Samuel said during his remarks at the opening ceremony. "Grace and Lily are still dead. My faith is still destroyed. Victoria still ignored 47 calls. Robert still sabotaged charitable assistance. None of that changes regardless of how many children this facility saves. But maybe memorial doesn't require believing that deaths served purpose. Maybe it just requires ensuring that specific failures that killed people we loved don't keep killing others when we have power to create systems that prevent repetition of tragedies that we couldn't prevent in real time. Some families are created not through blood or faith, but through shared commitment to transforming personal tragedy into systematic reform that benefits communities beyond individual loss. And the most meaningful memorial often emerges not from religious devotion or divine purpose, but from sustained collaboration between people whose grief has taught them that preventing future deaths requires addressing both systematic failures and personal priorities that made past deaths preventable, tragedies rather than inevitable losses that no intervention could have stopped. If this story moved you, if Samuel's lost faith resonated with you, if Victoria's devastation made you think about your own priorities, I need you to do something right now. First, hit that subscribe button. We create stories that don't just entertain. They force us to confront uncomfortable truths about the choices we make, the families we neglect, and the systems that fail the most vulnerable among us. Second, smash that like button if this story made you feel something. Whether it was anger at Victoria, sympathy for Samuel, rage at the healthcare system, or grief for Grace and Lily, that emotional response matters, and the like button tells me that these stories are reaching you in meaningful ways. But most importantly, I need to hear from you in the comments. Tell me, what did you think of this story? Have you ever ignored calls from family members because you were too busy with work? Have you ever lost someone because the healthcare system failed them? Have you ever watched someone's faith shatter because prayers didn't work when medicine could have? Have you ever built success only to realize it cost you the people who mattered most? Have you seen something like this in your own life? That moment when you realize that career advancement or personal ambition had blinded you to someone's desperate need for help? Share your story in the comments. This community is built on honest conversation about the hardest parts of being human, the choices we regret, the calls we didn't answer, the people we lost because we thought we had time. And if you know someone who needs to hear this story, someone who's prioritizing career over family, someone who's ignoring desperate calls, someone who's building success without counting the human cost, share this video with them. Sometimes we need stories like Samuel and Victoria's to wake us up before it's too late. Remember, 47 unanswered calls, a sister who died waiting, a niece who never got to meet her aunt, a Bible that holds memorial instead of faith. Don't let your story end the same way. Subscribe, like, comment, share. And if you're holding a phone right now with missed calls from family members, maybe it's time to call them back. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next story.